100 were taken ill, 18 seriously. But the Americans say casualties were higher and the Russians should have given more information. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl affected many countries in Eastern and Western Europe. The Soviet nuclear leak was first detected in Sweden. 60 miles north of Stockholm, tests at a power station showed unexpectedly high-level radioactivity on a worker's shoes. Russia has many nuclear stations like the one at Chernobyl, and they produce 15% of her electricity. The design is unique to Russia and not used in the West. News of the disaster was sparse, but on Wednesday the Russians released this picture said to be of the Chernobyl station after the fire. There was a brief mention of the disaster on Soviet television news. They said 2 people had died and 197 had been taken to hospital. There was also a short report in the newspapers, but nothing like the coverage in the Western media. But Soviet radio hams told a different story. A man in Kiev contacted a man in Israel and spoke of hundreds of casualties. The Americans took satellite pictures of the devastated power plant. They believe they are evidence that the casualties were much higher than officially admitted. In London, the Soviet ambassador saw Mrs. Thatcher and denied that many people were dead.
What about the reports over here, Ambassador, that several thousand people have been killed in the accident?
That's not true.
That's not true?
That's not.
Was Mrs. Thatcher annoyed that you didn't tell the West earlier about this accident?
Well, we informed the government of the United Kingdom this morning about this accident officially.
In Poland, where some radioactivity was measured, children were given iodine as a precaution. In Sweden, planes arriving from Eastern Europe were checked, and radioactivity at ground level was higher than normal. At Heathrow Airport, nearly 100 British students arrived home early. They had been studying in Kiev, and several were found to have some radioactivity on their clothes. So they were given new outfits for the flight home, British Airways tracksuits. Despite the catastrophe at Chernobyl, the Russians went ahead with May Day celebrations. As usual, the most elaborate display was for Russia's leaders in Moscow's Red Square.
homeless after the nuclear power station disaster in the Ukraine, and soldiers are still trying to control the reactor fire which flared after the accident last weekend. Tonight's disclosures follow a first visit to the Chernobyl area by two of Mr. Gorbachev's top men, Mr. Igor Ligachev, the number 2 in the Kremlin, and the Soviet Prime Minister, Mr. Ryzhkov. Over Britain and much of Europe, radiation levels have fallen today.
So only now, one full week after the disaster at Chernobyl, is the scale of the after-effects becoming clear. The new facts released by the Russians tonight are 49,000 people have been evacuated and will not be able to return to their homes in the near future. 200 people have radiation injuries, 40 of them serious, and between 20 and 25 people are critically ill. The fire at the reactor is still smouldering. This fullest information yet from the Russians came from a close aide of Mr. Gorbachev, the Moscow Communist Party chief Boris Yeltsin. Significantly, after a storm of criticism of Soviet secrecy, he gave his details in the West. First, some details to a West German television interviewer, including the admission that the reactor breakdown was caused by human error. Then tonight, Mr. Yeltsin said the Soviet Union would now consider joining an early warning system to discuss nuclear accidents. Mr. Yeltsin said the reservoirs, the dark shapes on these satellite pictures, are contaminated. He said Soviet army units are dealing with the reactor blaze by dropping sand and lead from helicopters and using remote-controlled vehicles to measure radiation, which he said is now falling, though a zone with a 19-mile radius around Chernobyl remains a poisoned no-man's land. Low levels of radioactivity have been detected right across the United Kingdom, up to 10 times the normal level in places, but experts say there is no risk to health. The Department of Agriculture is keeping checks on milk and vegetables, but they too say there is no cause for alarm.
There are certainly higher concentrations on the ground where it has rained heavily, but we have been looking there, and so have the other organisations who've been helping us. British Nuclear Fuels have done a lot of work around Sellafield where it's been raining very heavily, so we've got a good picture of that.
And there's no need for anybody to take any precautions?
No, none at all.
It's been revealed tonight that an escape of radioactive gas occurred at a British nuclear power station 5 weeks ago. It happened at the Dungeness A station in Kent. The Central Electricity Generating Board says it was a minor accident and there was no risk to health. Labour's environment spokesman, Dr. John Cunningham, said there was absolutely no excuse for keeping the incident secret. On the eve of the Seven-Nation Summit in Tokyo, both Mrs. Thatcher and President Reagan have urged the Russians to say more about Chernobyl. Mrs. Thatcher, who's been visiting South Korea, compared initial Soviet silence with American accounts of the shuttle disaster.
Today in Tokyo has seen the Americans for the first time turning up the heat on Moscow to come clean on exactly what's happened at the Chernobyl nuclear disaster outside Kiev. Japan's Premier Nakasone has joined the German and Italian leaders in promising a united front on the issue when the summit opens here tomorrow. Meeting with Italy's Premier Craxi, Mr. Reagan was demanding answers from the Russians.
Come forward and tell everybody exactly what happened. You can hardly call this kind of an accident an internal affair when other countries are threatened with the fallout of dangerous radioactivity.
In his weekly radio address to the American people, the president added,
"The Soviets owe the world an explanation. A full accounting of what happened at Chernobyl and what is happening now is the least the world community has a right to expect."
Through it all.
Flying MASH style into Panmunjom, Mrs. Thatcher was taken right up to the border between North and South Korea, with its Peace Pagoda in the south, its northern communist soldiers.
Evening, the government says there's no danger to the public from the cloud of radiation which has passed over the country in the wake of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The Environment Secretary, Kenneth Baker, has revealed that radiation levels were at their highest last Friday. Since then, they've been falling rapidly. But throughout Europe, there's still anxiety, and most countries, including Britain, are monitoring radiation levels closely. In the Soviet Union, the government has blamed local officials for not realizing the gravity of the situation until 36 hours after the explosion. These, then, are today's main developments. In Moscow, the Soviets have admitted mistakes were made. In Brussels, common market officials say they'll ban fresh food imports from Eastern Europe. And at Westminster, the Environment Secretary has said there's no health risk in this country.
People are asking, is it safe to drink milk? The answer is yes. Is it safe to drink water from the tap? The answer is yes. Is it necessary for children to take iodine tablets? The answer is no.
A guarded all clear also came today from radiation experts called together by the World Health Organization. After a day of talks in Copenhagen, they concluded that there was no danger for anyone outside the immediate area of Chernobyl. But they added that they had no way of predicting the long-term effects of the radiation. In Brussels, the Community's Executive Commission has recommended a Europe-wide ban on produce like milk and fresh vegetables from the Soviet bloc countries closest to the nuclear accident. But that doesn't guarantee a trade ministers' meeting tomorrow will implement such a ban. Some countries have already introduced their own bans. Measures to counter possible radiation caused chaos at the Brenner Pass, where vehicles bringing food into Italy were stopped for checks. The Italians have banned the import of a variety of produce from northern and eastern Europe and banned the sale of their own leafy vegetables. Farmers protested at that ban today by dumping artichokes on roads in southern Italy. Austria today extended its ban on the sale of vegetables grown in the open to include produce from Yugoslavia and Italy, as well as other Soviet bloc countries, and its own homegrown vegetables. The government has also advised people against jogging and cycling. Here, no bans, but the checks continue. In East Anglia, air and grass samples are being analysed. Vegetables are being checked in North Wales and elsewhere, as is the radiation level in rainwater. But news of the testing seems to have provided little reassurance.
But the thing is that you don't know, and I sometimes wonder whether they actually know what the risks are, and I think that's the point.
I know that amongst a group of friends of mine, there's been quite a lot of concern because there seems to be conflicting reports.
Fears about the radiation levels of rainwater led the Minister, Kenneth Baker, to advise Scottish farmers to use mains water instead to water their cows. All around the country, milk supplies are still being monitored, and though radiation levels have in most cases begun to fall, those tests will continue for several more days.
And the levels are declining.
The Ministry of Agriculture has taken many calls today from members of the public and farmers anxious for advice. There's no absolutely safe level of radiation, but with very low doses, the risks are very low. Everyone is exposed to radiation all the time, from natural background radiation. At the moment, the main interest is in radiation levels in milk. Averaged across the country, radiation is 40 times below the level at which milk would be withdrawn from sale in Britain. But there are one or two areas where peaks have occurred. In southwest Scotland, the levels have gone to 1/8 of what they would have to be if milk were to be withdrawn. The official advice is milk is safe to drink. But one radiation expert said today pregnant women might prefer to drink long life or powdered milk produced before the accident for the next few weeks, though he said the risks were minute. Among other questions being asked, are fresh vegetables safe to eat? Yes, but wash them first. Tap water is safe to drink, but experts say don't drink rainwater in areas of high rainfall like Scotland, North Wales and northwest England. And is it safe to go out in the rain? The answer is yes.
I think at the moment not to drink any fresh rainwater is a good thing because the risk is very small, but if you can avoid a small risk, why not avoid it? For the majority of the rest of the people in the country, they should not be worried. I know they'll be concerned, and that's why we're here. We're monitoring all the time. We want to give as much information as possible to people. They need not be worried at the moment. We're continuing to watch the situation.
Well, despite the assurances, the public clearly have been worried about the effects of radiation, in particular about that warning not to drink rainwater. And in the Commons today, there were accusations of government complacency and secrecy. John Cunningham for Labour called on the government to be explicit, frank and open. The public are entitled to know, he said. For the Liberals, Simon Hughes claimed that the effect of radiation on food, milk and water is near emergency levels. Gordon Wilson, the Scottish Nationalist MP, said the incident had displayed an alarming lack of concern by the government.
As more facts about the Chernobyl disaster emerge, it's becoming clear just how slow the Russians were to act after the initial explosion at the power station. Today they admitted that it was 36 hours before they began to evacuate the area, but the government is still anxious to convince the West that it's now coping well.
The head of the investigating commission was blunt. Local experts had not made a correct assessment of the accident. But the implication was they'd misinformed Moscow, which didn't realize the scale of the disaster until it was too late. The sequence of events is now becoming clearer. There was a chemical explosion in the early hours of Saturday morning. This damaged the structure of the building and started a fire. Radiation was released into the atmosphere, and the fire spread from the building to the core of the reactor. While the radiation leak seems to have been checked, it isn't clear if the fire is out. But it was not until the following afternoon, 36 hours after the accident, that most of the 50,000 or so people who lived nearby were evacuated. At that stage, the radiation levels were at their peak. This afternoon's press conference was tightly controlled, with few questions from the floor, and swiftly terminated. The officials flatly denied there'd been any delay in informing the rest of the world. We made information available when we had it, they said. Only in the last 24 hours, 10 days after the disaster, have local radio and television stations in the Kiev region started broadcasting advice to avoid some local vegetables and to spend less time in the open air. This is Brian Hanrahan for the 9 o'clock news in Moscow.